Good morning. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Hey, there we go. How's the sound? Okay, I'll take it. For not having tested, we're doing pretty well. And third week in a row of clouds. And now they're going to stay forever today. I don't know if they will, but they are here right now when we need it. And it's looking brilliant. Okay. Great to see you all this morning as we get into week 4. This is getting long now, like a long study. We have one more after this of our time together looking at vocation. Let's begin with prayer and then take a look at our study stuff. Lord Jesus, we ask for your blessing on our study this morning, that you continue to open our eyes by the light of your word to the beautiful callings that we have received from your hand each and every day. Not that they're always the happiest things, not that they're always painless or without sacrifice, but help us to find that in everything that we do, there is the glory of your name. That in everything that we do, there are opportunities to serve others, either by way of example or in even more tangible ways than that. So we ask that you continue to be with us and encourage us in the things that we do each and every day, that we would be filled with the freedom and joy of your gospel and live as your children each and every day of our lives. In your name we pray. Amen. Well, where have we been so far? We've had three different weeks. You can't really see the blue section, but there are arrows of like a revolving, it's like a revolving door or a record player spinning us around as we are free in Christ, the joy of the gospel. Everything that we do is pleasing to God because you are pleasing to God. And we looked at the law of love then, that in the spirit of faith and love is a really simple way to approach your daily activity. You approach it in faith, knowing the joy of the gospel, and you enter into your interactions and activities with others with the spirit of service and love. What benefits my neighbor? The arrow moves out of that into the cross, that undoubtedly the cross will find you, that there will be trouble in a sinful world, there will be trouble with people in every vocation that you have. You don't have to look for it. In fact, Luther would say, as soon as you venture to be godly in these areas and apply your faith to all the parts of your lives, you'll see quickly how difficult that is. And that sends us running back to Jesus and our freedom in the cross. Well, today, let's dig a little bit deeper into how this applies in our lives, okay? We want to dive deeper, and I want to challenge you to think specifically for your own vocational life, your own vocational circumstances, and what this looks like. As I look at the room this morning, I know that there are different people at every table. And if I could share a story from a midweek soup supper just a few weeks ago, I move around. Sometimes I sit down at tables, and I did that a couple weeks ago. And the conversation, I don't know, somehow came to like my knee and physical therapy and all that stuff, and it benefited me to be at that table with somebody who was a physical therapist. And suddenly their physical therapy training came to bear and benefited their pastor at random as they were encouraging me and tweaking some things and how I continued to move forward, rehabbing my knee from a year ago. So it's just one of those things that opens you up to the joy and the spontaneity of appreciating all the varied skills and gifts and thoughts and experiences and attitudes that everybody here has. And you don't even really pay attention who celebrates what happened at that table. I haven't written a thank you card. I mean, I think I expressed it in the moment. But these are like the little things that we probably don't even realize we're doing, but God is praised by it. And that's what we want to come to grips with today. So let's start with the big and the bold and the beautiful, as Martin Luther reminds us of this spontaneous, you never know when it's going to come of value. You never know what your vocation may be in the next minute. But the spontaneity of this paragraph, notice how he writes about a Christian. Martin Luther says, a Christian knows all things, can do all things, ventures everything that needs to be done, and does everything gladly and willingly, not that he may gather merits and good works, but because it is a pleasure for him to please God in doing these things. He simply serves God with no thought of reward, confident that his service pleases God. Takes us back to our first lesson in some ways, but it's those opening lines of that quote that caught my attention. It's the all things. Really, this is useful? Really, this is good? And this pleases you, what I'm doing right now? I mean, aside from sinful behavior, the Christian can celebrate this all the time. All of the little conversations, all of the active listening, all of the encouragement, all of the support, all of the interactions, all of the tiny labors of love. If I do it, somebody else doesn't have to. That just fills your day. All things. And I want you to look around and see something of a representation of all things in the body of believers. And that's what we want to explore further and more deeply in our study today. Is appreciating how my all and your all often are different. Because I can do all things. What he means is there's no activity that is in and of itself a secular and apart from God. Or there's no activity that's in and of itself, unless it's sinful. There's nothing where you have to detach God from it. So you venture into doing everything in every little part of your vocation or your work or any calling that you have in life, and you do it wholly and fully. But I can't learn how to fix cars, and I can't be an architect, and I can, but I can't do all of them. I can't do all of them. And that's where we're going to dive into this idea, this beautiful metaphor of 1 Corinthians 12 of the body of Christ. So let's do this together. Why don't you open up to 1 Corinthians 12 if you haven't already, and we'll start at least at verse 12 and look at 12 to 26. Familiar words, but approaching it with this vocation will be great. Once you have the page, I always like to look at the context. I think it helps us better understand what we're reading. So I'd like to look at the context a little bit too. I've got page 1151 in this black Bible version. Notice that in chapter 11, the second half of chapter 11 has a subtitle, I think over verse 17, if your Bible's like mine, that says, correcting an abuse of the Lord's Supper. Do you remember what they were doing as they came together as a congregation celebrating the Lord's Supper? They were being greedy about it. They were putting my needs over yours, so that when it came time to celebrate this with a broader meal, perhaps, some people left hungry and other people left drunk. And so there was a complete abuse, a complete disregard for others involved. And out of that chapter, that was its own issue, but there's a spirit at work in that is totally different than the Spirit of God. A spirit of disunity, and a spirit of division, and a spirit of competition, and a spirit of selfishness, right? That was there in the Lord's Supper. So then you get to chapter 12, and just scan the first 11 verses. He's going to talk about gifts of the Spirit, and how you were all once pagans at some way, shape, or form, led astray, worshiping mute idols, and influenced in a bad way. Everybody was lost there's something about that word gift and something about that word spirit that we suddenly glam onto. We're all in need of a gift. We're all in need of something we don't have naturally. And he starts here when it comes to the body of believers to celebrate in the midst of all of our disparity and differences, the fact that we do have something in common. Right? We all have required the Spirit. So the introduction that Paul gives to spiritual gifts is sort of surprising. You might have verse 3 memorized, that there is, no one can say Jesus is Lord except by the Holy Spirit. And I thought, boy, that usually is a phrase when I talk about faith. And why do I believe? Well, so you can't say Jesus is Lord without the Spirit. But Paul is using this as an argument to start talking about spiritual gifts. Nobody serves. Nobody does. Nobody is anything in the church without the Spirit. Nobody functions, nobody serves, nobody loves, nobody gives, nobody acts, nobody has any sort of status apart from what is gifted to you. This totally changes the dynamic of how we view one another. When we see everything as coming from the Spirit, he starts and lays that foundation, and then he goes into the differences. One of the things I want to drive at, and we're going to look at some questions and be more orderly about it, but one of the things as you appreciate this section of Scripture that we want to drive home is to say, what do I expect when I think of a congregation of different people? I would expect that we'd have something in common, but I also want to expect to see what I see today. That come Monday, you go off and you do that, I go off and I do this, and you go off and you do that, and you're there and you're over here, and somebody's meeting these people and somebody's talking to those people, and we all spread out in a tangled web, and none of our lives really look the same. But we have something in common at the heart of it all. Differences. Striking differences. And let's go deeper in appreciating how those function and operate together by looking at this section. So, imagine a baseball team composed entirely of catchers. Imagine an orchestra composed entirely of harpists. Trying to visualize those things, or like the piano's keys here on the PowerPoint, trying to visualize those things helps us understand why God gives us different talents and assigns us to different vocations. Paul's famous analogy in 1 Corinthians 12 makes these reasons clear. How does his comparison help us to understand the reason God makes us different, the important things we have in common despite those differences, and then talking more about what we should expect to discover in the members of our congregation? So let's read through this together. 1 Corinthians 12:12. Let me walk through it with you. Follow along. Just as a body, though one, has many parts, but all its many parts form one body, so it is with Christ. For we were all baptized by one Spirit so as to form one body. There's a design here. We are to form one body. Whether Jews or Gentiles, slave or free. Think of vocations. You didn't choose. I mean, we talked about vocations coming from God, and here some of them are listed by Paul, Jew, Gentile, slave or free. But we were all given the one Spirit to drink. And even so, even though that's true, the body is not made up of one part, but of many. So now my eyes start to change. And even though I can appreciate that God has made us equally what we are by His Spirit, that He has gifted us, or we would not be here today, equally by His Spirit. But I'm also to recognize and to expect a total diversity, many, many different parts. Let's see how he explores this then at verse 15. Now if the foot should say, because I'm not a hand, I do not belong to the body, it would not for that reason stop being part of the body. You can have an attitude that misses the point, but that doesn't negate what God has made you to be. And if the ear should say, because I'm not an eye, I do not belong to the body, it would not for that reason stop being part of the body. If the whole body, if the whole baseball team were pitchers, if the whole body were an eye, where would the sense of hearing be? If the whole body were an ear, where would the sense of smell be? But in fact, God has placed the parts in the body. Let's read that again. But in fact, God has placed the parts in the body, every one of them, just as He wanted them to be. Just as He wanted them to be. If they were all one part, where would the body be? As it is, there are many parts, but one body. The eye cannot say to the hand, I don't need you, and the head cannot say to the feet, I don't need you. On the contrary, those parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable, and the parts that we think are less honorable we treat with special honor. And the parts that are unpresentable are treated with special modesty, while our presentable parts need no special treatment. But God has put the body together, giving greater honor to the parts that lacked it, so that there should be no division in the body, but that its parts should have equal concern for each other. If one part suffers, every part suffers with it. If one part is honored, every part rejoices with it. That's our reading. Maybe before we look at some of the questions, what are the things that impress you? Do you have comments or questions on what we just read? Things that impact your attitude, perhaps, or things that struck you this time around? Yeah, that's a good question. How far does the metaphor go, as she's asking? When we talk about like the modest and the immodest parts, like are we supposed to think about that as church membership function? I think he's detailing the fullness of the picture to show there's different treatment happening. But I don't think that we would say that in the church the Spirit gave some gifts that are immodest gifts, right? That's kind of what you're getting at? Yeah, that we would say, oh, that's really immodest. We need to cover that one up a little bit or something. Right. No, the stress seems to be, especially with the other ones around it, some getting special honor. He's recognizing that these have different treatment. And that can be okay, but because that different treatment just recognizes that these are different parts and they serve different functions. But he seems to be valuing every single one of the part and gets down to the nitty-gritty, gets down to the individual member, and is saying if one part, if one thing, because this is meant to be a whole, if one part is suffering, we are all collectively missing something. And when one part is honored, we are all collectively honored in that. There's something that we just never do in our world today, and that's what he just said. There's just something, we never celebrate life like that, or we never really suffer like that. There's always this distance. I guess I can come back to the same problem we seem to discover all the time anew about ourselves. We're so bent on ourselves, or our worldview is about as big as I can see myself in it. And that then keeps us from this body mentality that he's trying to foster. Other things that you want to talk about some more? Please.
Translation. I've never
I don't know either. She just loved the phrase, the weaker parts of the body are indispensable. That was earlier rather than later. Where is that? 23. Yeah, the parts that are 22. Thank you. End of 22. The weaker are indispensable. Those parts of the body that seem to be weaker. That reminds me, when you came in today, I should have said this before, there was an NIV study Bible, a 1984, that was left in the women's bathroom 2 weeks ago. If it's yours, it's on the table. I don't know if you saw it sitting over there. It's on the table. Anyway. But yeah, beautiful translation. Those parts that seem to be weaker. We still have questions about the role and the function of some parts of the body. And I think our common sense might struggle with this. But faith doesn't have to. Faith can appreciate and say, I might not fully understand your role or whatever, but I appreciate you as a part of the body of believers. We need you. Let's look at what would you say then for the reason, letter A there, the reason God makes us different. Paul's comparison helps us understand the reason God makes us different. Especially 17 to 21. Please. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. We wouldn't have as many of our needs fulfilled, and that was the magic word. And I shouldn't say magic in church. Need. Need is the key word. Okay? Need is we have a lot of needs. We have a variety of needs. As great as our needs are, so are there needs for vocations that meet those needs. People who are thinking about those needs. And that is filled with variety and diversity because our needs are diverse. Our needs in life are diverse. Our needs in a church are diverse. Our needs in society are diverse. So you just think of all of these personal, family, society, congregational, these needs are huge. And they're wide. There's a wide array to them. And that is hitting the nail on the head. So God makes us different because of our needs. We would lose the fulfillment of those needs. We lose the sense of hearing. So you start to unpack the metaphor a little bit more and realize, why is my job existing in the world? Because some company needed my job, perhaps, needed my job, make your own applications, to function. And for that company to provide this service to a society that needs that service, you begin to see how everything is just this big old web of human need, and we're all filling different holes and pockets to do that. Anything else there? Linda, do you have you got something brewing? Is this a...
The metaphor to the body and the part we just talked about, that, if the whole body were an ear, where would the sense of smell be? It just makes me think the opposite. If you lose your sense of sight, your other senses really become keen and start to kind of take over for that. You're able to see through your smell or through your hearing and stuff. So, that it's kind of contrary to this thought. But it does happen in a congregation too. I mean, if you think the smallest thing, if it becomes a deficit, then other people or other functions have to help take over for that.
Yeah, she's talking about the way people then have to compensate for the loss of sight. You can compensate for that as best you can. It's still not the same, but that happens, and the same thing in a congregation when we have these different gifts and opportunities, things, the way you think, the way you have training or experience, bring to the table. You miss something when that piece of the puzzle isn't there, that part of the body isn't there. Let's look at the second thing. What are the important things, letter B? How does this comparison help us understand the important things that we have in common despite our differences? Okay, faith. We have faith in common. All of these parts of the body are facing their activity with faith, or they're entering on their activity starting with faith. Sarah.
God created all of us and He brought us all to this place.
Wow, it's so humbling to think that God created all of this. God orchestrated all of this. He made each part what it was to be. These are differences by whose design? By God's design. It starts to hit a mute button on that me that craves to be like this. It starts to stop that looking at the other side of the fence and longing for somebody else's this. One of the things that Luther keeps coming back to is, why is it that the student always wants to be the teacher, and the teacher always wants to be this, and somebody always wants to be something else? And there's just something going on in our hearts that just keeps looking the wrong way, and will never just look at my day and the joyful spontaneity that it holds before the Lord as a life pleasing to God. Good thoughts. That's very humbling thing. A source of our humility to look at one another and the parts of the body that we are around and say, God did this, and celebrate it in common. How about C? What should we expect then to discover about the members of our congregation? Bob.
We should look for the good in people and not excuses for criticizing other people. We should look for the good in people.
Okay, emphasize, I think you said it's in the same way of like putting the best construction on the way they are applying their vocational life. That's another big point from today is, I think I make it more on the second page than here. But there is a sense of, I know you because we have something in common, but there's also 1,000 things I don't know about you. Because we are all that unique, because we're all that different, I have to ask. I'd have to talk about. And you could have the same job as somebody else in the room here today, and you'd have different crosses in that job. And you'd have different joys from that job. And you'd have different attitudes as you carried out that job. Everybody in the end is totally unique. So a mom can say to another mom, I kind of know what your mommying is like, but at the same time, I have no idea what your mommying is like. We can find something in common with what faith brings to the table and wants to do in a vocation, but we also recognize the differences in how circumstantially that's carried out. So there's part 2 of what Bob said, and probably why I'm going, if I'm leaving you confused, is he said we should slow down the criticisms that we have of other people as they live out vocational life. And I think that that's huge for a church. It's easy to lament and say, oh, where is everybody? Where are all the volunteers? Where are all the this when we have the sign-up sheets and who's doing what? And you begin to get like this little, I really don't know the value of that kind of comment. There's something worthwhile for paying attention to this and encouraging people in being involved, but at the same time, I don't think I really know your story. I don't know what it's like to deal with your vocations that you have on your plate and how you're doing your best to apply your faith to them in life, and that may come out very differently and still be God-pleasing. I don't want to say too little or too much because I want to talk about that some more later, but in your head, Steve.
Not every part meets every other part either, and you can't help but think like your hand never really meets your heart, but you know it's there.
Yeah, interesting. And as part of thinking of the congregational diversity, he said, sometimes the parts of the body, they never meet each other, like your hand never really touches or meets your heart, so to speak, but you know that they're there, and you can value what they're doing. I think of the same thing here, in a congregation. Sarah.
I think that's why it's so important for people to be honest about how God brought them to a certain place or how their life circumstances put them in a situation, because then you value each other more and you praise God more because you see Him leading people along different paths, neither better nor worse than the others, but just different.
Yeah, different paths in life. You see God's leading rather than, what did you say? Rather than God's leading different paths rather than everybody needing to try to strive to have the same thing, right? This is just a whole outlook that we're unpacking here, isn't it? To celebrate, what do we say in America? You're pursuing your dream, and those people that aren't where I am is because they haven't worked as hard as I have. Or something. Like we imagine this. We do the competition thing, we do the comparison thing, and we come up with some reasons for why I'm here, or the woe is me, the victim playing that I would do if I'm not where I want to be, or I'm not where you are right now, and someday I'm going to have that, right? And we do that whole thing going on instead of saying, wait, somebody has put us in different places and opened some doors and closes others, and we can all be applying our faith and kind of put the criticisms aside and recognize celebrating the diversity that God has put among us. Does the New Testament church not talk about its poor and it's rich in the book of James? And it's not like it's sinful or the poor were just lazy and that's why they were poor. It's just the kind of things that we can think about a little bit more when you recognize God as the one organizing the body. Anything else? Was that a hand? No? David?
Question. With all this we're working on here, how would that affect someone, say, if they come in and they see us growing through everything we're doing and all this stuff, and wondering, do I belong here or not? What I'm trying to ask is, how does that help him to decide where he wants to be, or so on and so forth?
Okay, how does our growing, you said? Like in Bible class and things like that? He's asking the question about how does this help like an outsider or somebody who is getting to know our congregation or getting to know Jesus, right? How does it help them for us to be growing in all of these things? And he wants to ask the question, somebody saying, do I really belong here? I would hope that a study like this has so broadened the horizons of service to God and vocations that are pleasing that we're not saying, you know what, to be a real Christian, you first have to jump through these hoops and attend the monastery for this number of years and have some kind of charitable and loving and whatever spirit and life patterned out in front of you. This is what you have to do in order to please God. But we would invite them into a community that says, we're all at different places in life. And you are acceptable here because of Jesus. You're acceptable to God. And that the narrative would change from people who aren't like judging or criticizing without warrant, but would recognize somebody for who they are in Christ. Continuing to encourage them along those lines. I mentioned also church assimilation and Christ assimilation. I have assimilation on my plate here at Grace, and I think I've talked about this a little bit before, but you think organizationally, people getting assimilated into congregation, which I rephrase it in my head of like feeling at home. That it's a church home, a comfortability, and an involvement, that we kind of pursue these things with new members. That we want you to feel comfortable here. We want you to know what's going on. This is how we communicate. This is your church home. That you're valuable and have opportunities to serve where you would like to serve. And that's church assimilation. But as I pursue that, and some people, maybe they get involved right away and they jump in on something, and maybe they aren't as involved. But along the side of church assimilation, I am thinking also of like a Christ assimilation, and people who are living out their faith in everything that they do every single day. I think if I had all the time in the world, I would love to come and follow people to work and just observe and talk to them for a casual hour and let ourselves get interrupted by the phone and talk about how Jesus is here and what are your challenges and what is this like for you to be working at this place and where you are in life, and not just go to somebody's home, but to go to somebody's daily activity and help encourage to remind them that Jesus is here too. Assimilation to Christ and taking faith to every day of the week and not just a Sunday is another kind of goal that we have. And I just bring that up because it might spark for you that we don't need to sit in a certain kind of judgment place and say the real believers are the ones who sign up at least once a year for a soup supper, or who are there and have some official volunteer capacity at Grace, right? And until they have that, they're not really one of us. Well, I don't have to look at it that way. As you encourage people to take their faith and apply it however and wherever they go. I also don't want to make excuses, and I want to stay in touch with people, so there's this fine line you end up with. Any comments on that? Bob?
To me, church assimilation is the friendliness of the people at Grace. You can just sense it when you walk into the building. And love breeds love, and I just love that.
Oh, that was beautiful. He said, to me, church assimilation is the friendliness of the people you find when you come to Grace. And you just see it right away. And he said, where love meets love. That was really poetic. I like it. Linda?
I kind of think church assimilation is our job and Christ assimilation is the Holy Spirit's job.
Okay. Yeah.
The word versus.
Yeah, it's trying to compare these two together. But to at least keep our eyes open to all of it. I think in any company, you want to onboard somebody. You have an onboarding process and a transition, and here's what it's like to work here. Here's what it's like to be a believer here. And you said that church assimilation is things that we do, and the Christ assimilation, in many respects, is what the Spirit does through the ministry of the Word.
And it's not such a burden then to think, besides being friendly, I also have to, put my faith out there and maybe it seems uncomfortable. So I guess if you look at it that way, if I just do part one, Holy Spirit's working at the same time on part two.
Yeah. Thank you. Let's see. Let's go on to the next point here then. A person's eye is not likely to say, because I'm not a hand, I'm not part of the body. But in what way does this sometimes happen, however, when Christians look at the vocations of others? So this is somewhat like David was saying, what about that person who says, do I really belong here? We don't actually have an eye that's going to say, I'm not a hand and so I'm not a part of the body. But how does it happen when Christians look at the vocations of others to say, I don't feel a part? Erica?
I think of it as like when someone is in the church or new to the church and they're seeing other people active or they're reading in the bulletin about activities, but they're not seeing how they fit. And I think assimilation of our church is an ongoing thing so that everybody knows that there doesn't come apart in their membership here and their faith
feel part of it. And so that the church isn't just concentrating on, oh, we like these activities, so we're going to stay in this little circle. Because then you may risk having people that they're not going to be involved, or their best gifts are not as fruitful.
Okay, so she mentioned somebody's reading the list of, maybe we could have taken the news and notes today, like the list of activities or events that are going on. And they might not feel a part of that, but that's an ongoing process in learning and seeing the role that might play in somebody's life. But I also think of, how do I communicate vocation on a regular basis? How do I communicate this broad array of faith being put into practice all the time? I get nervous, I don't know if nervous is the right word, if the only church communication to you is, here's where you should volunteer, here's what we're offering, let me program what your next week is supposed to look like if you are a good church member. If not that is the words that ever get used, but could it come off that way, that these are the only things? It's really great to recruit our kids and into public ministry and encourage them to be teachers and preachers, and we recognize the value of the ministry of the word in the world, without which there is no spirit and there's no spiritual gifts. But at the same time, how do I communicate to those who decide that's not for me and go to other schools and say, good for you. Now what drew you to architecture? What drew you to engineering? And allow them to celebrate how they see it helping people. So I want to find some ways to do that. I want to encourage that and think about that some more with vocation, so it doesn't just seem like the church is always just saying one thing about Christian living and missing Monday to Saturday, in some ways, missing all the rest that could be promoted and celebrated. We have LinkedIn, and sometimes I try to find like Grace members that use LinkedIn, and I can see when you have a job change or a work anniversary. I get little notifications from LinkedIn. Raise your hand if you use LinkedIn. I should write down your names and then make sure that we are, networked together. But that way, sometimes, not often, but sometimes, usually I delete these pesky LinkedIn emails that I get, but I could go in there and say, hey, happy work anniversary. And I just did that this last week, probably because I'm thinking of vocation. But that's one way to kind of be there. I'm wondering am I programming too much when it comes to adult education, and I need to find a way to sort of unprogram and to just be there with people in a different way. Or both and, again, hours in a day. Jerome and Steve, did you have something else? No.
I always think the church, at least publicly, should be careful about some of the more subtle messages it sends about vocation. I always think of sermons when pastors use things like doctors as part of an illustration, or engineers or architects. I think our natural tendency is to go to those, prestigious jobs when we're creating metaphors for the body to understand that, we should really recognize, even in Bible studies and sermons, that there really are no jobs that are not noble in God's eyes, with the exception of maybe a few examples we can think of. But I always think of a stranger coming in and sitting in the pews for the first time. If that stranger is a sanitation worker or whatever, we just have to be careful not to reinforce in their head, hey, this is only a place for, especially in a church like Grace, that's been blessed. This is really a place for white-collar workers. I just think we should always be careful about those public messages. Yeah.
Exactly. We want to think about the metaphors, and apparently, I didn't necessarily pre-plan any metaphors today, but to think of the way society looks at certain careers one way and certain another, but to communicate it as we mean to communicate it, where all the different stations and callings and careers in life have their place and have their purpose and their value, because God values the believer. And I just see these beautiful people spread out all over the world and all different places of that world. And I think of, God put a believer there. And isn't that wonderful? And God put a believer in that circle. And I thought about, I didn't know how to phrase this activity, but how would we try to picture your web? Your own personal web of people, the connections that you have. One of my pastimes was disc golf, and so I'd be out on a disc golf course and I'd meet disc golf people. Well, I don't do that much of that anymore these days. But I'm at a park, I'm at playgrounds, and look, God put a believer at a playground, and that's just a great thing. But to think about your interests and your places, and to imagine that just with the few people in this room, how many different pockets of Milwaukee and Wauwatosa God by his grace has sent believers, and to celebrate all those little things. That's really a big goal of this whole study. Anything else there? Sue?
Changes of location, maybe a homeless person, or maybe a newly divorced person, or immigrants coming, who really feel out and not sure where they fit into anything. Just like David was saying, but I mean, this is a whole a changing and looking to those who are in the church to maybe give them some help.
Yeah. Continuing to identify our opportunities as a church to help people that often get neglected, or people who are going through transitions, whether they are newly transitioned to, what did you mention, homelessness, or newly divorced, or other things like that, and reaching out, when that takes place. Good reminder to keeping our eyes open is part of the spontaneity. Listening to others and paying attention to what's new and different for them, and how can I help, and meeting that need with love. Good thoughts. Thank you. Examine the thought. This is weird. I usually don't get a phone call on a Sunday morning. Grace Church is calling me. It rings with church bells. Do I answer? I should? Hello, this is Pastor Bondo. Oh, it's my voicemail. That's what it is. Okay. So sorry. Somebody's trying to reach me in my office. That was not planned. Is it time? No. We have 10 minutes. It's not. This is part of my vocation right now, where everybody be back in 5. Let's look at the second half of this study, because there's some little activity that I would really like to get to. Different is as different as. I have a couple nuances for the ways vocations are expressed differently on this page. Starting at the top with a nice quote. God needs good tax preparers. You probably never saw those words side by side like that before. Why? Because I do. It's just getting at our needs. The doctrine of vocation dramatically broadens the scope of what a person may consciously offer to God with a happy conscience as a sacrifice of thanksgiving, and which God will receive in his good pleasure. If his eyes light up for doctors and janitors and sanitation workers and mechanics, so might ours. So, however, and whenever and wherever your faith is brought to bear on whatever you're doing, is a way to describe this arena of differences. One of the goals of looking at vocation is that you can look at every day of your life, and your real day, like your normal, typical day, and suddenly see it sparkle with the pleasure of what is God's pleasing. That you don't have to suddenly change this or shift this for it to have value and meaning and purpose. And that's that's there in that quote, and that's there in the idea of however, whenever you bring your faith to bear on what you're doing. But I think of, and maybe you could read through these, and then I want to do an exercise underneath. Example questions for different vocations that you have. Think about, to see how faith comes to bear, I would start asking these questions to help lead somebody to understand how their faith is here, how God has made this a vocation that fills a need. You could look at some of these questions. What are the challenges that you had this week? Where is the joy in what you did? Where's the cross? What does this vocation have to do with faith? How does your devotional and worship life sustain you for it and its demands? What boundaries have you identified so as to preserve room in your life for other vocations that you have? So you look at these things and you see how they interrelate with each other, and I think you could make a list of some of your more obvious vocations, or the ones that you sort of have planned. Who knows what God will do, but the ones that you seem to have, and go through some of those questions and see where you get to dig deeper into making the applications of bringing your faith to bear on that environment, recognizing this as a cross and not just a that's work or that's life, but recognizing it as something that drives you to Jesus. And that's what those questions can do. So those are for you, and I think you should use that as homework the rest of this week. Let's do an activity then. Areas of concern. This comes out of a book, and I should have cited it at the bottom somewhere, but I can't remember which book it is offhand right now. But the example for working people is to look at the different things and let people talk about it. Let people think through different nuances of their work environment that can challenge faith or be something of an issue, an area of concern. So under the working people, you have an italicized list of examples: competitiveness, job transition, relationships at work, salary and benefits and power issues, grace and works, working at home, and maintaining boundaries. You could see all of these things as being something that a believer would want to think through. How do I be honest and faithful in my job, even when I'm working from home and the boss isn't around? How do I set up boundaries for my work, still be faithful to work, but also to my other callings? These are the things that you end up identifying. So what I want you to do at your tables is find the person who has the next birthday. We'll take 3 or 4 minutes. Whoever has the next birthday at your table, pick one of your vocations and talk about some areas of concern. Or maybe you flesh out some of the ways you see competition in that environment, or you see something from this list relating to it. Okay? So go. Just a few minutes. Make an application to the next birthdays. Okay, let's come back together and close. I hope that you found that as something of a helpful exercise, or really a chance to get to know somebody. You got a little window into somebody's life that perhaps you didn't have before. And that's the kind of listening. Those are the kinds of questions and the ways that we can continue to learn and get to know others around us, thinking more about what it's like for them in their vocation. And I may have no idea, even though I know what certain jobs do, I might not know really that much of what it's like for you in doing that job. And it's a great way for us to celebrate the body of Christ. I'm going to close with the final quote that's down there. It's by a different results paragraph. Just because I think it's helpful. Luther's doctrine teaches us not to judge other believers, but to respect their choices. Among the long list of things we cannot see into is the full weight of all the burdens people are carrying in their several callings, and how heavily they carry them. So even as we begin to recognize vocation and the callings of God all around us, we see how differently they end up playing out in people's lives. And some people have unique burdens in those vocations, even though they may have the same vocation as someone else. And it allows us, I think it frees us up to be more personal in the way that we communicate and relate to other believers, and to be an ongoing support system for one another. Try to find those who have similar vocations to you or something like that, and engage them, and not shy away from the kind of encouragement that you can share as a fellow believer. So one more week on this next week as we bring Christ into every part of our lives to the glory of God. That'll be next week as we wrap this up. Thanks for your time today. The blessing of the Lord